When Darwin was 22, he found himself in the midst of a Brazilian rainforest. Confronted by the sheer beauty of it all, he experienced an overwhelming sense of awe. Unfortunately, Darwin's sense of awe about nature did not last. He explained that the universe of exquisite design and purpose he once saw in nature failed now that he had discovered his law of natural selection. This guy that you're seeing is named Peter Singer. He is a professor of bioethics at Princeton University. He is one of today's most notorious academic proponents of the devaluation of human life. For example, he writes that the life of a newborn baby is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. Singer's views are well known, at least among those who follow debates about the sanctity of human life. What's less known is where he gets his ideas from. In an interview, though, he told us, "All we are doing is catching up with Darwin. He showed that we are simply animals. Humans had imagined we were a separate part of creation, that there was some magical line between us and them. Darwin's theory undermined the foundations of that entire Western way of thinking about the place of our species in the universe." Now, I don't agree with Peter Singer on much, but I do agree with him here. Darwin's theory did do much to undermine the foundations of the Judeo-Christian view of human beings and their unique place in the universe. Darwin, of course, is best known for developing his theory of evolution by natural selection, which we have talked about over this weekend. And according to that theory, all living things are related by common descent. That is, we are all ultimately descended with modifications from one simple ancestral form. And then the second big idea is the evolution of life from this single-celled organism to us was driven primarily by natural selection or survival of the fittest. According to modern Darwinism, randomly occurring mutations and recombinations in genes produce variations among organisms in a population. Some of these random variations will help organisms survive and reproduce more effectively. Over time, these beneficial variations will come to dominate the population of organisms, and over even more time, these beneficial variations will accumulate, creating entirely new biological features in organisms. Now, apart from its contributions to science, Darwinian theory has fueled three big ideas for culture that have had significant consequences for our society's view of human life. First, Darwin's theory fueled the idea that humans aren't special. According to Darwinism, humans have the same origin as rats and fleas and toadstools, and we aren't fundamentally different from other animals. Darwin himself recognized that his theory diminished the case for human uniqueness, writing in one of his notebooks that it is absurd to talk of one animal being higher than another. He also complained that people often talk of the wonderful event of intellectual man appearing when, in fact, the appearance of insects with other senses is more wonderful. Darwinian biologists today relish emphasizing that humans are just another animal. Biologist Charles Zucker says that, quote, "In essence, humans are nothing but a big fly." Geneticist Glenn Evans claims that the worm represents a very simple human. One science journalist writes that genetics shows that there isn't much difference between mice and men. That's not true, by the way. And the late Morris Goodman of Wayne State University liked to insist that we humans appear as only slightly remodeled chimpanzee-like apes. In the Darwinian view, humans are not unique. We are not special. A second big idea fueled by Darwinian theory is that humanity is the product of a blind, unguided process. As Darwin himself made clear, natural selection is an unintelligent process that is blind to the future. We've talked about this before, so I'm not going to go in great depth on this, but in Darwin's words, there seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. Natural selection cannot select new features based on some future goal. It only favors traits that are beneficial to survival right now. As a result, evolution by natural selection is the result of an unguided, unplanned process. Direct quote, as 38 Nobel laureates declared when they issued a statement defending Darwinian theory in 2005. According to Darwinism, then, amazing biological features like the human eye, or the wings of butterflies, or the blood clotting system are in no way the purposeful result of evolution. Rather, they're the unintended byproducts of chance and necessity. The same holds true for higher animals such as you and I. In the words of the late Harvard paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson, man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. In the Darwinian worldview, you and I are accidents of natural history, not the purposeful creations of a loving God. The third big idea fueled by Darwin's theory is that the great engine of progress in the history of life is mass death. Instead of believing that the remarkable features of humans and other living things reflect the intelligent design of a master artist, Darwin portrayed death and destruction as our ultimate creator. As he wrote at the end of his most famous work, thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. Just ponder that for a moment, that we are not the products of a loving creator, we're ultimately the products of famine, death. There is famine and death, but Darwin and other people noted that. But this is quite interesting that Darwin makes that our ultimate creator. It's from the worst things that we came, and that has some implications, and which we're going to tease out. Ideas have consequences, Richard Weaver pointed out many years ago, and I say for more than 150 years, these three Darwinian ideas, these big ideas for culture, have shaped social beliefs and actions in virtually every sphere of human life, including race relations and ethnicity, medicine, environmentalism, criminal justice, ethics, and religion. In our action-packed 45 minutes, we're going to talk about some of these areas. So let's start. Charles Darwin was not the world's first racist, and he was better than some racists in that he opposed slavery. Nevertheless, Darwin's theory exerted a powerful influence on the development and growth of what became known as scientific racism, or so-called scientific racism. As Harvard evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould acknowledged, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859 when Darwin wrote his book On the Origin of Species, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. Now, why was this? Well, Darwin believed that his theory of natural selection provided a scientific explanation for why races and ethnicities should have unequal capacities and why there were higher and lower races, in his view. Think about it. The specific traits an animal needs to survive differ based on the animal's environment. Thus, in Darwin's view, there was no reason to expect that natural selection acting on different populations will produce the same traits in every population, or in this case, in every race. That's why Darwinists expected to find differences in the capacities of people in different racial groups. Accordingly, Darwin, in his book, The Descent of Man, declared that there are significant differences in the mental faculties of what he called men of distinct races. He also argued that the break in evolutionary history between apes and humans came between the Negro or Australian Aborigine and the gorilla, thus depicting blacks as the closest human beings to apes. This was Darwin himself. Now, Darwin's supporters further popularized these ideas. For example, we have German scientist Ernst Haeckel, who was a correspondent of Darwin and one of the most celebrated champions of Darwin's theories in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Haeckel created this widely disseminated diagram of human evolution that portrays the evolutionary gap between the highest Teutonic male and the lowest human as larger. So the gap between the highest human and the lowest human is larger than the gap between the lowest human and the highest ape, which was given African-like features. This idea that non-white races represented a throwback to lower stages of evolution was widely embraced throughout the scientific community in the early 20th century. Consider the views of American biologist Charles Davenport, a member of the National Academy of Sciences and regarded as one of the founding fathers of modern genetics. Davenport was obsessed with the idea that some races were still stuck in lower evolutionary stages. Darwinian racism played a role in the justification of one of the first genocides of the 20th century. From 1904 to 1908, the German military attempted to eradicate the Herero and Nama peoples in southwest Africa. In October 1904, General Lothar von Trotha issued what became known as his extermination order, declaring that the Hereros either had to leave German Southwest Africa or face extinction. Herero men would be executed, and Herero women and children would be driven into the desert where they would die of starvation or dehydration. Now, how did von Trotha justify this? He justified his extermination campaign by an explicit appeal to Darwin, telling one newspaper that human feelings of philanthropy could not override what he called the law of Darwin's, the struggle of the fittest. In the United States, meanwhile, thousands of indigenous people from around the world were put on public display in the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, in what has become known today as one of the largest human zoos. Those displayed were supposed to represent lower stages of human evolution, and that's how they were described. And if I had time, I would go into that in a little more depth. In 1906, in the Bronx Zoo in New York City, actually displayed a man from Africa, Ota Benga, in a cage with a monkey as an evolutionary missing link between humans and apes. I tell the story of this in my documentary, Human Zoos, that you can find for free on YouTube. By the 1920s, new immigration restrictions had been imposed in cooperation with Darwinian biologists who decided that certain races were lower on the evolutionary scale, and so they needed to be kept out. These tended to be from non-Northern European countries. So fortunately, my grandparents immigrated from Austro-Hungary, from Ukraine. They were Ukrainians shortly before World War I. If they had waited until later, they may not have gotten here, because these new immigration restrictions were kind of punitive on anyone who wasn't from the Nordic countries or from England. Other countries were, again, these were regarded as lower on the evolutionary scale. Since the civil rights movement, most scientists fortunately have abandoned Darwinian racism, but there are still exceptions that you'll find over the last decade or so. In 2007, this man, Nobel Prize-winning scientist James Watson, co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, got into some hot water, sparking an uproar by suggesting that blacks are biologically inferior to whites. And what was not noticed as much when this uproar came out, well, how was he justifying that? Where did he get that idea? If you read his book at the time, he made very clear that he was suggesting this was because human evolution was the explanation. Again, just like Darwin, if you have humans develop not because God created or designed them, but because they were different populations that were being, enacted upon by natural selection, there's no reason that you should think different varieties of humans should be fundamentally equal. That was Watson's argument, which straight line back to people like Darwin or Charles Davenport. Outside the scientific community, unfortunately, white supremacists and the so-called alt-right are unfortunately attempting to resurrect Darwinian arguments for racism previously rejected by the scientific community, where, again, they're appealing to Darwinian evolution to justify a racist understanding of, the people who are not white are supposedly less evolved. Okay, but let's move on. One of the most far-reaching social impacts of Darwinism was in the field of medicine. It became known as eugenics, which was described by its proponents as the self-direction of human evolution. The inspiration for eugenics came straight from Darwin's theory. In Darwin's view, the key reason humans developed their outstanding capabilities, again, was not because we were designed that way by a creator, but because natural selection ruthlessly weeded out the unfit. The problem, according to eugenists, was that in the name of humanitarianism, civilized societies were now doing their best to care for those who nature would have killed off. They thought this would lead to disaster. In, again, his book, The Descent of Man, Darwin criticized modern society for methodically undermining natural selection's process of elimination by offering asylums for the mentally ill, homes for the handicapped, hospitals for the sick, and welfare programs for the poor. Darwin even warned about the dangers of vaccinating people against smallpox, which he thought preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed. Darwin's stark conclusion, and this is a direct quote, "Thus the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must, not that this may or might, this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed." He's talking about humans here. Now, a kindly man in private, Darwin was torn by the implications of his theory, and he thought human sympathy would not allow people to follow his theory to its logical conclusion. Likewise, many of his followers believed it would be too cruel for humans to go back to the law of the jungle and just allow people to die. So they wanted to develop a kinder, gentler way to mimic natural selection through modern science. That was the goal of eugenics. Charles Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, is generally regarded as the official founder of eugenics, and he actually coined the term. Positive eugenics focused on encouraging those deemed the most fit to reproduce more, while negative eugenics focused on curtailing reproduction by those deemed unfit, including mentally handicapped people or people presumed to be mentally handicapped, not quite the same thing, and criminals. Eugenics became the consensus view of the scientific community for decades. And it was promoted not just by politicians, but by leading scientists. The politicians thought they were doing the bidding of the scientists. Eugenics was a crusade, a scientific crusade, promoted by the leading scientists around the world. In America, eugenics supporters included biologists at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, and the National Academy of Sciences. Now, eugenics may not be a necessary implication of Darwinism, but it is also definitely not a twisting of Darwin's theory. It's very closely and logically connected. Again, if you think that our creator is the law of death and the survival of the fittest, and you further realize that we are doing our best as civilized people to counteract survival of the fittest in society by helping the poor and the disenfranchised and the handicapped, if you realize that, then in a Darwinian scenario, it makes perfect sense that we are facing doom. And so if we don't want to destroy the human race, we either have to go back to the law of the jungle, that would be a more pristine Darwinism, or if that's too unpalatable, we need to recreate something like it. This is actually how the eugenists argued. They recognized that, well, the most purely Darwinian thing would just be go back to the law of the jungle, but like Darwin, they were trying to be sympathetic. So they said, well, let's try to do this more kindly by reinstituting something like natural selection through science. The impact of eugenics on American public policy was far-ranging, including laws on who could marry, immigration restrictions on races considered lower on the evolutionary scale, already mentioned, and forced sterilization of those considered less fit in Darwinian terms. In America, 60,000 women were sterilized against their will in the name of eugenics. Actually, that's officially. It was more than that. Those were sort of like legally compelled. Sometimes you might be sent to a mental institution, even if you weren't mentally handicapped, and then said, well, if you voluntarily agree to be sterilized, we'll let you out. Well, was that really a voluntary sterilization? No, not so. Elsewhere around the world, the impact of Darwinian eugenics was even more horrifying. Germany's eugenics movement sterilized hundreds of thousands of people and murdered 300,000 disabled children and adults, many in gas chambers dressed up as shower stalls. Many people don't know that it was during the eugenics killings of the handicapped that the Nazis developed some of the methods they used to murder millions of Jews, especially the shower rooms that were actually gas chambers. That was developed in the eugenics program by the German medical scientific community to kill the handicapped, and then it was redeployed to kill millions of Jews. After the general public, of course, learned about the atrocities committed in the name of eugenics in Germany, Darwinian eugenics was widely discredited and at least went underground. But Darwinism continued to influence bioethics and bioethics debates in other ways. So let's actually talk about some other things that are relevant to happening today. Scientists and political activists alike have appealed to Darwinian theory to justify abortion by claiming that babies in the womb are not fully human. And where do they get this idea? Well, they invoke an idea known as embryonic recapitulation. This was propounded by the same Ernst Haeckel that had the racist diagram. This is another of his diagrams that purports to show that human infants replay the history of evolution as they develop in the womb. They go through a fish stage, a lower mammal stage, and more before fully reaching the state of a human being. Thus, if someone aborts an infant while she is still in the fish stage, it's no more immoral than killing a fish. Embryonic recapitulation is junk science, and it has been discredited even among evolutionary biologists for decades now. That has not stopped this evolutionary argument from being invoked repeatedly as a justification for abortion in public policy debates. And not only just 100 years ago. In the 1980s, it was cited by University of Michigan geneticist James Neal. He was a member of the National Academy of Sciences and one of America's top geneticists. It was in the 1990s cited by Carl Sagan in an article he wrote. There are many more examples that I actually talk about in my book, Darwin Day in America, if you want documentation. But one of the most recent examples was a few years ago, journalist Christopher Hitchens in his book, God is Not Great, defended abortion by claiming that in utero we see a microcosm of nature and evolution itself. We begin as tiny forms that are amphibian. No, we don't, actually, but that just shows the staying power of this Darwinian argument for abortion. Another justification based on Darwinism for abortion focuses on natural selection. This is Planned Parenthood official Alexander Sanger. And those of you who know the history of Planned Parenthood should recognize the Sanger name. Yes, he's the grandson of Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood. So he wrote a book a few years ago called Beyond Choice, where he made an argument for the good, the moral good of abortion. It wasn't a tragic choice, it's a good thing. Why? I'll quote his words. We cannot repeal the laws of natural selection. Nature does not let every life survive. So, humanity uniquely and to its benefit can exercise some dominion over this process and maximize the chances for human life to survive and grow. Basically, he argues that by enacting abortion, we are really enacting our form of natural selection. We're mimicking what natural selection does in nature to kill off defectives and those who really shouldn't grow up and be part of the population. Darwinism has also fed into debates over infanticide as well. University of Chicago evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne, one of the most noted Darwinists today, has argued on his blog for legalizing infanticide for babies with biological handicaps. He wrote, after all, we euthanize our dogs and cats when to prolong their lives would be torture, so why not extend that to humans? Coyne recognizes that the reason we do not do so is because of a view of humans that Darwinism has yet to completely overcome. The reason we don't allow euthanasia of newborns is because humans are seen as special, writes Coyne. And I think this comes from religion, in particular the view that humans, unlike animals, are endowed with a soul. So what religion is he talking about? When religion vanishes, as it will, so will much of the opposition to both adult and newborn euthanasia. Thus speaks Jerry Coyne. A similar Darwinian devaluation of human life can be found among some radical environmentalists. In the book and film The War on Humans, my colleague, bioethicist Wesley J. Smith, has documented how the growing coercive utopianism of some environmentalists is grounded in a visceral hatred of humans and the denial that human beings are special or unique. Underlying the radical environmentalist hatred for humans is the Darwinian rejection of human uniqueness. Christopher Maines, one of the early leaders of the environmental group Earth First, explains, Darwin invited humanity to face the fact that the observation of nature has revealed not one scrap of evidence that humankind is superior or special or even particularly more interesting than, say, lichen. This kind of Darwinian misanthropy motivated eco-terrorist James Lee, who in 2010 took the staff of the Discovery cable channel hostage. In an online manifesto, Lee called on the Discovery Channel to Talk about evolution. Talk about Malthus and Darwin until it sinks into the stupid people's brains and they get it. Saving the planet means saving what's left of the non-human wildlife by decreasing the human population. That means stopping the human race from breeding any more disgusting human babies. Now, the really scary thing about it isn't that Darwinism feeds the misanthropic views of a mentally unbalanced terrorist like James Lee. It's that the same views are motivating leading cultural figures and academics. Just as one example, consider this man. His name was Eric Pianka before his death in 2022. He was an evolutionary zoologist at the University of Texas, one of America's premier research institutions. Pianka argued that humans are no better than bacteria, and other things on this earth have been here longer than us, and they have a right to this planet too. That includes the wasps that sting you, ants that bite you, scorpions, and rattlesnakes. Pianka went on to criticize humans for, and I'm quoting him here, sucking everything we can out of Mother Earth and turning it into fat human biomass. Pianka urged the reduction of the Earth's human population by up to 90%, and called on the government to confiscate all the earnings of any couple who has more than 2 children. And this is what he said: you should have to pay more when you have your first kid. You pay more taxes. When you have your second kid, you pay a lot more taxes. And when you have your third kid, you don't get anything back. They take it all. People who don't think that ideas have consequences have not spent a lot of time in the subculture of ideological Darwinism. Now, Darwin's theory has also exerted a corrosive influence on morality and human accountability. In a Darwinian view, morality is reduced to pre-programmed behavior in service of physical survival. In the words of Darwinian philosopher Michael Ruse and the late Harvard evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson, morality is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. That's all it is. In an important sense, ethics as we understand it is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. Think about that. Is that all that morality really is? Attacks on personal responsibility have featured prominently in Darwinian accounts of human behavior during the past century and a half. For example, Darwinism played a key role in the development of what was known as the New School of Criminology by Cesare Lombroso, an Italian criminologist, and other criminologists in the late 19th, early 20th century. These criminologists tried to find Darwinian explanations for why people engaged in crime, even labeling some persons born criminals because they were supposed to be throwbacks to an earlier stage in evolutionary history. But the diminishment of free will and personal responsibility is not the only way Darwinism has impaired or impacted morality. Darwinism has also provided a robust biological justification for moral relativism. Here's why. According to Darwin, specific moral precepts develop because under certain environmental conditions they promote survival. So natural selection doesn't just explain humans, it explains the development of morality. But once your conditions for survival change, so too do the dictates of morality. That's why we find in nature both the maternal instinct and infanticide, both honoring your parents and killing them when they become feeble. Natural selection chooses whatever behavioral traits best promote survival under the existing circumstances. A Darwinian understanding of morality makes it very difficult to condemn as evil any human behavior that has persisted, because every trait that continues to exist, even among a subpopulation, has an equal right to claim nature's sanction. Presumably, even antisocial behaviors such as fraud and pedophilia and rape must continue to exist among human beings because they were favored at some point by natural selection and therefore have some sort of biological basis. Of course, you could still justly condemn such behaviors if there existed a permanent moral standard independent of natural selection. But the existence of such a standard is precisely what orthodox Darwinism denies. For the most part, Darwin himself did not press his relativistic conclusions or analysis of morality to its logical conclusion, but he certainly laid the groundwork for others who came after him, and his ideas helped reshape how people think about morality. Nowhere has the Darwinian view of ethics had a severer impact than in family life and human sexuality. The thinker most responsible for the breakdown of traditional sexual ethics in Western culture likely was Harvard-trained evolutionary zoologist Alfred Kinsey. Adopting a thoroughly Darwinian approach to sexual morality, Kinsey argued that any sexual practice that could be found somewhere among mammals could be regarded as what he called normal mammalian behavior and regarded as unobjectionable. Today, many evolutionary psychologists have gone beyond mere sexual relativism and are affirmatively arguing against monogamy. They claim that we were bred by Darwinian evolution to have multiple sex partners, which means that we are programmed for promiscuity and infidelity. In their view, the very idea of faithful monogamous marriage contradicts our biology and must therefore be abandoned. One prominent evolutionary psychologist to advocate this view is Christopher Ryan, co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Sex at Dawn. In the words of Ryan, marriage in the West isn't doing very well because it's in direct confrontation with the evolved reality of our species. Ryan says he wants to save marriage by making it consistent with Darwinian biology. For him, that means redefining marriage to include multiple partners at the same time. Now, a final profound impact of Darwin's theory has been in the area of religion, where Darwinism has supplied a potent scientific rationale for atheism. Now, Darwinism doesn't logically necessitate atheism, but it certainly does encourage it. If nature really supplies proof that the history of life is the product of an unguided process, then that would seem to make an atheist worldview much more credible. That's why so many scientists have made unguided Darwinian evolution a cornerstone in their case for atheism. So, we have Oxford evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins saying that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. The late Harvard evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson declared that the existence of a God who directs organic evolution and intervenes in human affairs, really the Christian God, is increasingly contravened by biology and the brain sciences. Or at my alma mater, University of Washington, we have an evolutionary psychologist, David Barish, who wrote in the New York Times, "The more we know of evolution, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that living things, including human beings, are produced by a natural, totally amoral process with no indication of a benevolent, controlling creator." In a nationwide survey of American atheists and agnostics, nearly 7 in 10 atheists and more than 4 in 10 agnostics say that unguided chemical evolution and Darwin's unguided mutation natural selection mechanism have made the existence of God less likely for them personally. Similarly, more than 7 in 10 atheists and nearly 4 in 10 agnostics agreed with evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. But Darwinism's impact on religion hasn't just been limited to just atheists and agnostics that we've already heard earlier today. It also has reshaped how a number of theists, particularly a number of many Christians, view God, especially at Christian colleges and universities, where scientists and theologians have tried to revise Christianity to make it compatible with Darwinism. Because Darwinian evolution is by nature unguided, theistic Darwinists often downplay or reject the idea that God actively directs the development of life. For example, Roman Catholic biologist Kenneth Miller, whose this quote was cited earlier, I'll just re-emphasize it. Ken Miller purports to be a devout Roman Catholic. He's a biologist at Brown University. He wrote a book claiming that mankind's appearance on this planet was not preordained. We are here as an afterthought, a minor detail, a happenstance in a history that might just as well have left us out. Or take former Vatican astronomer, the late George Coyne, who even claimed that because evolution is unguided, not even God could know with certainty that human life would come to be. Not even God. Still, other theistic Darwinists challenge the idea that God's handiwork in nature is observable, especially in biology. This is sort of the hiddenness of God. Christian geneticist Francis Collins suggests that, well, maybe evolution could appear to us to be driven by chance, but from God's perspective, the outcome would be entirely specified. I'm quoting from him now. Thus, God could be completely and intimately involved in the creation of all species, while from our perspective, this would appear a random and undirected process. Now, I should note that it's not clear that Francis Collins actually believes that God really actively directed it, but he was holding out, for those who wanted to believe it, he said, well, you can believe that, but you just would need to accept that God made the world look like it was the product of a random and undirected process. In other words, again, God makes the history of life look random and undirected, even though it really isn't. Contra Collins, for thousands of years, Jewish and Christian thinkers believed otherwise, maintaining that God's design could be clearly seen throughout nature. This isn't just clear in the Bible, some of the passages I talked about last night, but in the early church fathers, right through the Middle Ages and on, people like Aquinas and many others. On the Protestant side, the Reformed thinkers, this is not one of the things that they differed on with Catholics. They also thought that the Christian tradition universally taught that God's design could be clearly seen throughout nature. So this idea that God may have created a world that looked random and directed, but just through the eyes of faith, we sort of trust that it's not, is pretty preposterous as an idea in the history of Christian intellectual tradition. So, as a way of wrapping up, so we have some time for questions, Darwinian philosopher Daniel Dennett, who died earlier this year, has aptly described Darwinism as a universal acid that dissolves traditional ideas about morality, human responsibility, and God. I say, without question, Darwinian theory has exerted a corrosive impact on human society as a whole. Tragically, it also had a corrosive impact on the personal lives of many individuals, including Charles Darwin himself. When Darwin was 22, he found himself in the midst of a Brazilian rainforest. Confronted by the sheer beauty of it all, he experienced an overwhelming sense of awe. Surely, he thought, man was more than a mere animal and that there was some greater purpose behind nature than mere survival. He was right. Unfortunately, Darwin's sense of awe about nature and about human beings did not last. Fast forward to the ending chapter of his life as he wrote his autobiography. Reflecting on his earlier sense of awe in that rainforest, Darwin wrote that now not even the grandest scenes in nature would inspire him to have such a view. Why? He explained that the universe of exquisite design and purpose he once saw in nature failed now that he had discovered his law of natural selection. Darwin also wrote that now for many years I cannot endure to read a line of poetry. I have also almost, I'm quoting from him now, almost lost any taste for pictures or music. My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts. Very sad ending to his life that I would say, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to say what caused it, but it is interesting to me, his view of human beings that was very bleak in the end. You could see in his own life where he no longer enjoyed poetry, music, paintings. He thought his mind was a machine. Very sad. Our ideas about nature do have consequences for individuals, for each of us, as well as for society as a whole. Fortunately, as you've been hearing at this conference, nature herself is pointing us back to the reality of God's grandeur expressed throughout every part of the universe, every level, driving us to conclude with Pope Benedict, we are not some casual and meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed. Each of us is loved. Each of us is necessary. Thank you.